Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow walk through a world that never had streetlights, never had markets, never had the comforting buzz of a neighbor's late-night argument. Before cities existed, humans were more listeners than talkers, more watchers than planners, and, strangely enough, probably better at sitting still than most of us today. So, dim the lights, find a soft corner, maybe a blanket, and let us drift into a time when the loudest noise was probably just a bird landing nearby, or a twig snapping underfoot. It's calm, it's slow, and honestly, it is exactly the kind of quiet that makes you realize just how noisy our modern lives really are. Imagine the first humans wandering over vast plains or dense forests. They had no roads, no maps, no idea what was beyond the next hill. Their lives were measured in small, almost imperceptible rhythms. The rising sun dictated when to wake. The setting sun dictated when to sleep. A simple misstep could mean losing a foot to a snake bite. But then again, maybe the snake was more afraid than they were. Life was not dramatic, not intentionally perilous. It was quiet, and they had to be quiet to survive. Every rustle, every shadow, every subtle movement mattered. One could argue that humans at that time were experts in patience, because they had no choice but to be. Let's float over to a small clan living beside a river. Water was life, and perhaps more than water, fish were life. They spent hours watching the currents, seeing which patterns hinted at a hiding fish or a snapping turtle. And they learned, very early, that rushing or panicking did not impress anyone. Not the river, not the fish, and certainly not the wind. They were observant. Children would mimic adults without realizing that they were learning the same survival techniques that had been passed down for generations. Picking up a leaf or identifying edible roots wasn't just clever, it was vital. And yes, children probably got into trouble, but not the kind we think of today, more like accidentally eating something bitter and sitting quietly while their stomach complained. The beauty of this era is in its absolute silence. Imagine nights under an open sky without lanterns, torches, or any artificial light. Darkness was absolute, and humans adapted slowly to hearing the smallest sounds, the shifting of grass, the faraway roar of a predator, or the cautious whisper of a companion. They were awake to nuances, awake to the subtle details we often miss today. Perhaps some of them even enjoyed the silence. After all, if your entire day is dictated by survival and observation, silence becomes a companion rather than a void. Speaking of companions, humans weren't solitary for very long. Even in this early, city-less world, they formed small clans, tight-knit groups who understood each other's patterns and habits. One could say they had a certain social sophistication, but of the quiet kind. You didn't need words to know someone was nervous or excited. A flicker of the eyes, a shift in posture, a barely audible sigh, all of these were meaningful. There was no gossip, no politics, just observation and empathy. At least, empathy filtered through survival instincts. It was like a very slow, very deliberate conversation with the world and each other. Food was always a patient pursuit. Hunting was not a high-speed chase in the way movies like to show. It was sitting, waiting, studying, learning, and gathering was almost meditative. Roots, nuts, berries, Mushrooms, they were collected with a careful awareness that too much could spoil, too little could starve you, and a misstep could mean illness. And yet, they learned to adapt, to turn every error into knowledge. Every small failure was absorbed quietly, not loudly lamented, and certainly not broadcasted on some hypothetical prehistoric social feed. Let's drift now to the very human quirks that existed even then. Some individuals in these clans were unusually brave, or unusually cautious, or perhaps unusually stubborn, and these traits mattered. The brave ones might spot danger first. The cautious ones might notice a change in wind or smell a predator long before others did. And yes, stubbornness could be a problem. Imagine someone insisting on walking into a forest they knew nothing about. Because they wanted to explore, the rest of the clan would sigh silently, perhaps follow reluctantly, and perhaps learn something new while cursing the brave fool under their breath. Early human personalities were remarkably familiar, just without the Starbucks or streaming services to amplify them. Sleep, unsurprisingly, was complicated, with no shelters except crude huts or caves. Humans were at the mercy of weather, animals, and insects, but they adapted, as always. They found positions that minimized discomfort, learned to sleep in shifts if necessary, and became accustomed to the occasional cold night or sudden rainfall. And yet, there was a strange comfort in the rhythm. Sun rises, we wake. Sun sets, we sleep. The world was predictable, if slow, and humans, as a species, are unusually good at appreciating predictability when it's the only constant. We can float now to a different clan, perhaps in a slightly colder region. They would need fire, not just for warmth, but for cooking, safety, and social bonding. And fire, as simple as it seems to us, was a miracle. Learning to keep it alive through wind and rain was a skill passed down carefully. Some probably fumbled, got scorched, or used too much wood. But the lesson was quietly absorbed. And around the fire, people might talk or they might just sit, staring into the flickering light, thinking their thoughts, imagining possibilities, perhaps even wondering what was beyond the nearest mountains. That quiet reflection, punctuated only by crackling flames, was, in its own way, a luxury we rarely get today. And the seasons dictated everything. Spring meant growth, summer meant abundance, autumn meant preparation, and winter meant endurance. Humans noticed these patterns, respected them, and planned accordingly. They couldn't ignore nature's rhythm, nor could they impose upon it. The idea of control was, for them, laughable. And yet, slowly, with trial and error, they began to understand no, not control, but negotiation with the world, a subtle, quiet negotiation, almost invisible in its genius. So, as we drift further into this prehistoric calm, it's worth noting that humans, even before cities, were remarkably creative in their routines. Tools were crafted not for fashion, but for survival. Sticks became spears, stones became knives, and bones became needles. Every object had a purpose, and every mistake taught something new. There was no rush, no deadlines imposed by anyone but the relentless world itself. And perhaps that's why they survived so effectively for so long. They were patient, observant, and quietly resilient. Let's float over one last time to a single night, where a small clan sits huddled under stars. A parent hums a tune not loud, not for entertainment, but for comfort. A child drifts to sleep, unaware of the predators or cold, trusting only the warmth nearby. Silence is absolute, save for the soft murmurs and the occasional rustle of leaves. And in that silence, humans find a rhythm that would, millennia later, give rise to cities, kingdoms, dynasties, and all the chaos we're more familiar with. But tonight, there are no cities, just quiet, just survival, and the gentle, patient observation of life as it unfolds. As we drift gently forward, still well before cities, before crowns, before anyone decided power should come with a chair and a title, it becomes clear that humans were already deeply human. Personalities existed long before politics did. There was always someone who thought they knew better, someone who absolutely did not, and someone who just wanted everyone to stop moving so fast and please sit down for a moment. Leadership in this era was not elected, announced, or inherited. It emerged slowly, almost accidentally, usually because one person had survived something unpleasant and remembered how not to do it. Again, experience, not ambition, ruled here. And honestly, that may have been humanity's most peaceful phase of authority. Imagine a clan following a particular individual not because he was charismatic, but because he once remembered where water was during a dry season. That was it. That was the resume. No speeches, no symbols, no dramatic origin story. Just quiet competence, of course. This also meant leadership was fragile. One bad decision, one wrong turn, and people would simply stop listening. No coups, no assassinations, just a silent consensus of, we're not doing that again. It's remarkably efficient, if slightly unforgiving. Now let's linger on the idea of status. Because even without wealth or land ownership, humans still found subtle ways to differentiate themselves. The best hunter was quietly respected. The most observant gatherer was trusted. The firekeeper, the one who understood how to coax flames back from near extinction, was treated with something close to reverence. Not worship, exactly, but a very real sense of please don't annoy this person. Power was practical, not symbolic, and vanity had little room to grow. Mostly because vanity doesn't help when you're hungry. And yet, quirks still flourished. There was probably someone obsessed with tools, endlessly reshaping the same stone, convinced this time it would be perfect. Others might roll their eyes silently, knowing full well that perfection was not required to cut meat or scrape hides. There were those who talked more than necessary, and those who barely spoke at all. Silence did not mean lack of thought. In fact, it often meant the opposite. Thinking was done inwardly, carefully, without the pressure to perform it aloud. Let's float now into the emotional lives of these early humans, because while they lacked language as we know it, they did not lack feeling. Grief existed, deeply and quietly. When someone died, there was no ceremony in the modern sense, but there was recognition. Bodies were treated with care. Places were remembered. Loss lingered, not dramatized, but carried. There was no philosophical framework to explain death, just an acceptance that it happened, and that life continued around the absence. and perhaps that made grief simpler. If heavier, no bargaining, no questioning fate, just quiet endurance. Children, meanwhile, grew up quickly, but not harshly. They learned by watching, not by instruction. Mistakes were corrected gently, because shouting wastes energy and attracts attention. Play existed, though not separately from learning. Throwing stones was both a game and a skill. Climbing was both fun and necessary. Curiosity was encouraged not through praise, but through survival itself. If you didn't pay attention, you learned very fast why you should have, and then you didn't do that again. Let's gently shift toward food sharing, because this is where early human morality quietly formed. Hoarding was dangerous, not just socially, but practically. Food spoiled, hunger spread. Cooperation was not a moral ideal. It was a survival strategy. Those who refused to share likely found themselves alone, and alone was rarely survivable. So generosity became instinctive, not virtuous, just logical. And with it came the earliest forms of trust. Trust that tomorrow someone else would bring food. Trust that weakness today would be repaid with strength later. Sleep patterns were communal, and privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. And yet, boundaries still formed. Humans are very good at sensing when to give space. Someone grieving might sit apart. Someone anxious might pace. No one demanded explanations. Emotional intelligence did not require vocabulary. It required observation, which these humans had in abundance. Let's float now toward the concept of fear, because fear shaped nearly every decision. But it wasn't the frantic, panicked fear we often imagine. It was measured, informed fear. Fear of unfamiliar sounds. Fear of strange smells. Fear of sudden silence, which was often worse than noise. And fear taught caution, patience, and restraint. Fear kept people alive long enough to grow old, which, in this era, was a quiet achievement. And old age itself carried a certain weight. Elders were not revered because of wisdom alone, but because survival over time was proof of something valuable. They remembered weather patterns, migration paths, edible plants. Memory itself was a resource. Forgetting could kill, remembering could save generations. And so stories emerged, not for entertainment, but as storage, a way to pass information without writing, without symbols, without permanence. Spoken carefully, remembered deliberately. Let's pause briefly on boredom, because yes, even in this survival-focused world, boredom existed. Long hours of waiting, watching, listening. Humans are restless creatures, and yet they learned to sit with stillness, to endure quiet without distraction, to let thoughts drift without needing to capture them. In many ways, this may have been humanity's most meditative era, though no one would have called it that. As night falls again, firelight flickers, shadows stretch, and the day ends without announcement. No clocks, no schedules, just fatigue and darkness. Someone adjusts the fire. Someone checks the perimeter. Someone hums softly, not to entertain, but to soothe. And the world remains vast, indifferent, and quietly beautiful. These humans do not know they are ancestors. They do not know cities are coming. They only know this moment, this warmth, this silence, and for now, it is enough. we'll continue drifting forward next, slowly approaching the moment when silence begins to fracture, when permanent settlements form, and when human personalities begin to collide a little more loudly with each other and with the world. But for now, rest here, in the calm before complexity. We drift forward now, very slowly, to the moment when humans made a decision that would quietly ruin their relationship. With silence forever, they stopped moving. Not all at once, not dramatically, and certainly not because someone gave a speech. It happened gradually, almost lazily. A good river here, fertile land there, animals that kept coming back, and suddenly wandering felt unnecessary. Temporary shelters became semi-permanent. Semi-permanent became permanent. And just like that, humans invented staying. At first, it probably felt convenient. Why walk endlessly when food keeps appearing in the same place? Why dismantle shelters when the weather patterns are predictable enough? So people stayed, and staying changed everything. When humans stayed, they began to notice each other more. Not just skills or usefulness, but habits, annoying habits. The way someone chewed. The way someone always took the best spot near the fire. The way someone contributed less, but ate the same amount. Anyway, silence was still present, but now it had tension in it. Let's float gently through one of these early settlements. It's small, a cluster of huts, smoke rising slowly. The air smells like earth and fire, and something fermenting slightly wrong. People wake up close to one another, not by choice, but by necessity. Privacy is still theoretical. Everyone knows everyone else's routines, and routines, once observed long enough, become irritating. Humans were never meant to observe the same people forever without distraction. Cities would eventually solve this by adding strangers. But for now, there were only the same familiar faces, over and over. Food production changes things too. Farming introduces waiting. Long, slow waiting. You plant something, and then you wait. And while you wait, you watch other people waiting. And while watching, you think. And thinking leads to opinions. Opinions about effort, fairness, and who is definitely not pulling their weight. Before, survival tasks were immediate. Now, they were delayed. And delayed rewards always bring resentment. Someone worked hard last season. Someone else coasted. And memory, which once saved lives, now started keeping score. Let's pause on ownership, because this is where things get quietly messy. When people wandered, nothing belonged to anyone for long. When people stayed, land began to feel personal. This is my patch, my field, my water source. Not because someone declared it, but because they worked it. And once something feels like yours, losing it feels unfair. Humans began defending places instead of just moving away. Conflict did not explode suddenly. It simmered quietly, passive-aggressively, probably with a lot of staring. Leadership changes too. Remember the competent survivor who naturally led because they knew where water was? That role becomes complicated. Now leadership involves managing disputes, storing surplus, organizing labor, and suddenly, charisma matters more than memory. The loudest voice carries weight. The confident one gets followed, and occasionally, The wrong person ends up in charge simply because they talked more. Of course they did. And this is where hierarchy creeps in, slowly and awkwardly. Like an idea no one asked for, but everyone now has to deal with. Silence, once protective, becomes suspicious. If someone is quiet now, people wonder why. Are they plotting? Are they upset? Are they hoarding thoughts the way others hoard grain? Communication increases, but it's still limited. Misunderstandings flourish. Someone gestures the wrong way. Someone misreads intent. And suddenly, there's tension where there was none yesterday. Humans begin inventing social rules, not because they enjoy structure, but because without it, staying together becomes unbearable. Let's drift toward family structures, because permanence changes reproduction. Children are no longer just part of the clan. They are heirs to land, skills, and status. Parents invest more emotionally. Expectations form. Disappointment becomes possible. Someone's child is stronger. Someone else's is sickly. Comparison begins. Quietly. Always quietly at first. And with comparison comes anxiety. What if my lineage fails? What if theirs thrives? These are new worries, and they settle heavily into the human mind. Elders now carry even more weight, but also more pressure. Their memories guide planting cycles, conflict resolution, and tradition. But memory can be wrong. Seasons change. Rivers shift, and when an elder's advice fails, trust fractures slightly. Respect no longer feels automatic, and once respect has conditions, it becomes political. No one calls it that yet, but it is. Religion, or something like it, begins forming here. Not dramatic gods or temples yet, just ideas, patterns. Rituals meant to explain why crops failed or children died. Humans hate unanswered questions. Silence used to accept them. Settlement does not. People want reasons. They want meaning. And when meaning is invented, it tends to come with rules. Follow this. Avoid that. Do this gesture. Say these words. Because why not add invisible expectations to already complicated lives? Let's hover briefly over health, because staying put introduces disease. Waste accumulates. Animals live closer. Water gets contaminated. People get sick more often, and sickness feels unfair. You didn't wander into danger. Danger came to you. This changes how humans think about safety. Fear becomes internal, not external, and anxiety settles in. Slowly, sleep becomes lighter. Noise increases. Babies cry. Animals move nearby. Tools clatter. Silence is no longer guaranteed. People wake more often. Irritation grows. And with it, emotional outbursts, small ones, quiet ones. Someone storms off, someone sulks, someone refuses to help the next day. Emotional regulation becomes a skill, not a given, and not everyone learns it well. Of course not. Let's float to the edges of the settlement, where someone is already thinking of leaving. Some humans never adapt to staying. They feel trapped, watched, evaluated. Silence out in the wild still calls to them. And sometimes they go, quietly, without drama. And the settlement barely notices, except for the absence. Humans are very good at normalizing loss when it's gradual. As night falls again, the settlement settles. Fires burn, conversations murmur, disputes pause until morning. And somewhere between the huts, silence still exists. Thinner now, but not gone. It waits. It always waits. Next, we'll drift towards surplus, status, and the early seeds of inequality. When humans begin realizing that some people can have more than others, and that realization refuses to stay quiet for very long, we drift onward, still slowly, into the phase where humans accidentally invent the most emotionally exhausting concept imaginable. Extra food, extra tools, extra time. Surplus, on paper, sounds like a gift. And at first, it absolutely was. No one complained about not starving. But surplus has a habit of quietly rearranging how people see themselves and each other. Once there is more than enough, the question shifts from will we survive to who gets what. And that question never sleeps well. In earlier times, food appeared and disappeared quickly. You ate it, shared it, or lost it. Now, with storage pits and clay containers, food could wait. And when food waits, so does power. Whoever controlled storage controlled security. And whoever controlled security suddenly mattered a little more than everyone else. Not officially, of course. No one announced it. But people noticed. They always do. Let's float gently through a settlement after harvest. There's grain drying in the sun. There's a sense of relief in the air. Bellies are full. Muscles rest. And slowly, quietly, comparisons begin. Who harvested the most? Who contributed the least? Who seems oddly comfortable? Humans don't need numbers to calculate fairness. They feel it instinctively, and when fairness feels off, irritation follows. Calmly, patiently, with long memories. Status emerges not through violence, but through usefulness. The best organizer, the best negotiator, the one who remembers who owes what. Record keeping hasn't been invented yet, but mental accounting is alive and well, and mental accounting is unforgiving. Someone forgets a favor, someone remembers it forever, and this is where resentment becomes generational. Let's pause on clothing, because it matters more than it should. With surplus time comes decoration. Jewelry from bone or shell, dyed fabrics, subtle signals of identity. And suddenly, appearance becomes a language. Not loud, not explicit, but visible. Someone has more ornaments. Someone's clothes are cleaner. Someone else notices. And once noticed, it cannot be unseen. Humans have always been very good at noticing imbalance. Leadership hardens here. What was once fluid becomes fixed. Roles become inherited. Children of organizers become organizers. Children of storage keepers learn storage. And slowly, quietly, opportunity narrows. Talent matters less than lineage. Of course it does. Humans love shortcuts. And inheritance is the laziest form of trust. Now let's drift toward marriage, because this is where emotion and economics start sharing the same bed. Pairings are no longer just about companionship or reproduction. They're strategic. Who brings land? Who brings grain? Who connects families? Romance exists, surely, but it is secondary. Practicality always gets first say. And with that comes disappointment. Quiet disappointment. the kind that settles into daily life and never fully leaves. Children feel this shift too. Some grow up surrounded by abundance. Others don't. And children notice inequality long before they can name it. One child eats better. Another sleeps warmer. Another is expected to work harder. And these differences shape personalities early. Confidence here, anxiety there, resentment everywhere. Let's float toward conflict, not the dramatic kind, but the exhausting, slow kind. Disputes over land boundaries, over water access, over stored goods. They don't explode. They drag on glances, avoidance, passive aggression. Someone forgets to help. Someone accidentally damages a tool. And conflict becomes social, not physical, which is somehow worse. Religion grows heavier now. Rituals multiply. Offerings increase. Explanations become more detailed. Gods begin caring deeply about grain, fertility, and obedience. Funny how that works. Divine approval starts aligning suspiciously well with whoever already has power. Of course it does. And questioning that alignment feels dangerous, even if no one says why. Silence changes again. It's no longer just absence of sound. It's restraint. Things you don't say. Complaints you swallow. Thoughts you keep hidden. Silence becomes political, strategic, and humans learn very quickly that saying less can be safer than saying truth. Let's hover briefly over illness again, because surplus doesn't prevent it. Sometimes it worsens it. When important people fall sick, panic spreads, rituals intensify, blame circulates. Someone must have angered something. Someone must be responsible. Illness becomes moralized. And once morality enters health, fear deepens. As night settles over this settlement, there is warmth, food, and quiet conversation. But beneath it all is tension, subtle, constant. A sense that things are no longer simply shared, but measured, counted, remembered. And humans, once content with survival, are now burdened with comparison. We'll continue drifting next into the rise of authority figures who begin separating themselves entirely from labor, leaning fully into command and quietly inventing the idea that some people are meant to rule, while others are meant to listen. And somehow, many will agree. We drift forward again, unhurried, into the moment when certain humans realize something quietly revolutionary. If enough people listen to you, you don't actually have to do the hard parts anymore. You can supervise. You can decide. You can point. And pointing, as it turns out, is far less tiring than digging, hunting, or hauling water. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives gently, wrapped in responsibility, justified by necessity. Someone has to organize things, after all. Someone has to think big thoughts while others do the smaller, messier ones. And just like that, labor and authority begin their long, awkward separation. At first, these early authority figures still pretend to work. They lift a basket here, carry a tool there, just enough to remain relatable. But slowly, the balance shifts. Their hands stay cleaner, their backs stay straighter, their days fill with discussion rather than effort. And no one openly complains, because organizing does matter. Coordination matters. Planning matters, but the distance grows subtly, comfortably. Let's float through a settlement where this is already taking shape. One person now decides when planting begins. Another settles disputes. Another manages surplus. They sit more than they stand. They speak more than they act. And their words carry weight, not because they are wiser, but because everyone has quietly agreed they should. Power in this phase is still fragile. It relies on consensus, on memory, on reputation, but it is power nonetheless. And once power exists, it wants reinforcement. Symbols begin appearing. Slightly better clothing, a special seat, a staff or ornament that means nothing practically, but everything socially. Humans love visual shortcuts, and symbols save effort. You don't have to explain authority if it's already visible. Of course you don't. Let's pause on ego, because this is where it finally gets room to stretch. Earlier leaders were useful. Now they begin feeling important. Not loudly, not arrogantly, just enough to believe their comfort is deserved. Their rest is necessary. Their opinions are superior. And anyone who disagrees is quietly labeled difficult, or ungrateful, or dangerous. Hierarchy solidifies through routine. People start expecting direction. They stop questioning decisions as often. Responsibility becomes centralized. And with that comes blame. When things go wrong, eyes turn upward. Leaders respond by protecting themselves, often by creating rules. Rules distribute responsibility downward while authority stays put. It's efficient, emotionally exhausting, but efficient. Let's drift toward justice, because this is where leadership starts pretending to be moral. Disputes are no longer settled by mutual agreement alone. Someone decides, someone enforces, and fairness becomes subjective. Punishments vary, favor creeps in. The powerful receive gentler outcomes. The inconvenient receive harsher ones. No one calls it corruption yet. It's just how things are. Religion intertwines even tighter now. Authority figures speak for the gods, or at least interpret their moods. Decisions gain divine backing. Obedience becomes sacred. Questioning becomes risky. And fear, once reserved for predators and famine, is redirected inward. Fear of disapproval, fear of exclusion, fear of consequences. Children born into this structure accept it as normal. They don't remember a time without hierarchy. They learn who speaks and who listens, who commands and who complies. And because it's familiar, it feels natural. Humans are very adaptable that way, comforting and deeply concerning. Let's hover over the leaders themselves for a moment, because despite appearances, they are not at ease. Power isolates. They trust fewer people. They sleep lightly. They worry about challenges. They monitor loyalty. And paranoia creeps in, softly, late at night. Authority promises security, but rarely delivers peace. Silence around leaders changes again. It becomes reverent, controlled. People lower their voices. They measure their words. Silence becomes submission, and leaders grow accustomed to it, depend on it, need it. As the settlement settles into night, the fire burns steadily. The leader sits slightly apart, slightly elevated, watching shadows flicker. Others rest. Some resent quietly. Some accept fully. Some don't think about it at all. And the world continues turning, indifferent to who commands whom. Next, we'll drift into the moment when leaders realize their authority can outlive them. When power stops being temporary and starts becoming inherited. And when families quietly begin preparing their children not just to live, but to rule. We drift onward, very gently, into the moment when authority stops being a role and starts becoming a family tradition. This is where things get quietly irreversible. A leader looks at their child and thinks, not consciously, not maliciously, but very practically, that it would be easier if the child simply continued things. Less disruption, less arguing, less uncomfortable transition. And just like that, power stops circulating and starts settling. Deeply, permanently. At first, it's framed as stability. The child grows up watching decisions being made, absorbing the rhythms of command. They sit nearby during discussions. They learn names, favors, alliances, not because they are special, but because they are present. Presence becomes preparation. Others notice, of course. They always do, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. They flatter the child slightly more. They include them slightly earlier, and without any announcement, succession begins. Let's float through a household where this is happening. The leader's child eats better, sleeps warmer, works less. Not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. Why exhaust the future organizer? Let them observe. Let them learn. Let others carry the weight. And slowly, the child internalizes something dangerous. That comfort is normal. That effort is optional. That direction is their natural contribution. Other children grow up differently. They learn labor, obedience, patience. They learn where they stand without ever being told. The distance between children grows quietly, invisibly, until it feels natural. And when it feels natural, it stops being questioned. Marriage becomes sharper now. Families with authority seek families with resources. Alliances form not out of affection, but out of foresight. Children are paired early, sometimes before they understand what pairing means. Love is secondary. Stability is everything. And disappointment becomes a background emotion, steady and manageable. Let's linger on education, because this is where inequality gets polished. The children of leaders are taught stories of greatness, lineage, destiny. The children of workers are taught skills. One learns to command narratives. The other learns to survive within them. Both are valuable, but only one is rewarded. Religion helps smooth this transition. Gods begin favoring bloodlines. Ancestry gains spiritual weight. Authority becomes inherited not just socially, but cosmically. And questioning lineage starts feeling like questioning the universe itself, which is very convenient if you're on top. Leaders age, their movements slow, their decisions become cautious, and around them, their children wait, patiently, politely, already acting as intermediaries, already testing boundaries. Power transfers gradually, almost invisibly. And when the old leader finally fades, the settlement barely pauses. Things continue as intended. Silence around inherited power feels heavier, less flexible. People speak carefully because they know this authority is not going anywhere. Resignation replaces negotiation, and resignation, while quiet, is deeply exhausting. As night falls, the future ruler sleeps comfortably, unaware that generations from now, This moment will echo into something far larger. For now, it's still small, still manageable, still local. But the pattern is set. Next, we'll drift toward expansion when settlements grow, collide, and compete. And when inherited authority begins looking outward, wondering not just how to rule people, but how to acquire more of them, we drift forward again, unhurried, into the moment when staying put no longer feels like enough. The fields are working, the storage is full, the hierarchy is stable, and that, for certain people, becomes boring. Humans are excellent at surviving, but once survival feels secure, they start asking unhelpful questions like what else? And that question is rarely peaceful. At first, expansion is practical. More land means more food. More water means more security. So settlements send people outward, not as conquerors yet, but as explorers. They map rivers. They mark boundaries. They notice other settlements doing the same thing. And this is when curiosity shifts into comparison. Who has more? Who is stronger? Who looks easier to deal with? Or easier to push? Let's float gently along a border zone. It's not dramatic, just a stretch of land both groups use occasionally. A shared hunting ground. A water source. At first, cooperation happens. Then schedules overlap. Then misunderstandings. Someone arrives earlier than expected. Someone stays longer than agreed. And resentment forms quietly, like sediment. No one wants conflict, but no one wants to retreat either. Leadership changes tone here. Authority becomes protective, defensive. Leaders speak of safety, of threat, of preparedness, and people listen because fear is persuasive, especially when it sounds reasonable. Tools become sturdier, watchfulness increases, silence at night feels sharper. Every unfamiliar sound matters again. Let's pause on identity, because this is where us and them become emotionally real. Clothing, accents, rituals, small differences become emphasized, not accidentally. Distinction is useful. It clarifies loyalty. It simplifies fear. And once people internalize identity, they defend it fiercely, even when they can't explain why. Children grow up hearing stories of the other settlement. Not monsters, not yet, but competitors. Untrustworthy, different, and difference, over time, becomes threat. It's a very short journey. Trade emerges alongside tension. Goods move between groups. Ideas too. And trade is peaceful, but fragile. A bad exchange, a perceived insult, a disagreement over value, and trust fractures. Trade requires fairness, and fairness requires shared understanding. That's hard when cultures are still inventing themselves. Let's hover briefly over the leaders again. Expansion gives them purpose, vision, justification. They speak of destiny, of growth, of ensuring the future, and their children absorb these ideas eagerly. Power loves expansion because it validates itself. Violence, when it appears, is hesitant. Limited. A skirmish, a theft, a retaliation. It's exhausting, not glorious. People don't want it, but they endure it. And once endured, it becomes thinkable, acceptable. Another tool in the human kit. Silence shifts again. It becomes tense. Alert. People listen not just for animals, but for other humans. The night is no longer neutral. It carries possibility. As settlements expand and collide, authority grows firmer. Obedience becomes survival. Dissent feels dangerous. And humans, who once thrived on cooperation, now navigate allegiance. As night settles, fires burn on both sides of unseen borders. Each group believes they are reasonable. Each believes the other is unpredictable. And both are correct. Next, we'll drift into the moment when leaders realize that fear can be organized, when conflict becomes structured, and when the quiet world finally begins preparing for something resembling war. Still slow, still reluctant, but no longer avoidable. We drift onward, still slowly, into a phase that feels heavier. Even though almost nothing looks different at first glance. Fields are still planted, fires still burn, children still grow. But something subtle has shifted in the air. Fear is no longer just a reaction. It's a plan. And once fear becomes planned, it stops being temporary. Leaders begin talking about readiness. Not panic, not urgency, just readiness. Tools are stored closer. Lookouts are assigned. Paths are watched. And these precautions feel sensible. Responsible, even. Of course they do. No one objects to safety, but safety has a way of expanding its needs. One guard becomes two. To become permanent. Permanent becomes expected. And suddenly, watching replaces working for a small group of people. Let's float gently through a settlement at dusk. The light is low. The perimeter is quiet. Someone stands still, listening. This isn't dramatic vigilance. It's routine, and routine is what makes it powerful. Fear, when normalized, becomes invisible. People stop noticing the tension because it's always been there. Weapons change slightly. Still tools, still practical, but now clearly designed for other humans. Not animals, not plants, humans. This is a psychological shift more than a technological one. Preparing to harm something that thinks like you do requires a certain emotional adjustment, and humans manage it by distancing, by simplifying, by telling stories about necessity. Children watch all of this. They learn which areas are safe, which names are spoken cautiously, which questions are discouraged, and they adapt quickly. Children always do. Fear becomes background noise. Like wind, always present, rarely questioned. Let's pause on discipline, because this is where leadership tightens its grip. In times of perceived threat, unity becomes sacred. Dissent becomes dangerous. People who question decisions are labeled careless or naive or disloyal, and most people choose silence instead. Silence, after all, has kept humans alive before. Training begins. Nothing formal, just repetition. How to move together, how to respond, how to follow signals. Cooperation shifts from survival-based to command-based, and command, once practiced, becomes familiar. Comforting, even. Being told what to do removes uncertainty, and uncertainty is exhausting. Religion adjusts again, quietly. Protection rituals appear, blessings for defenders, stories of divine favor in conflict. The gods are no longer just concerned with crops and children. They care deeply about borders now. Funny how that happens. Let's drift briefly into the emotional cost, because it's subtle but constant. People sleep lighter, they laugh less freely, conversations shorten, trust narrows to smaller circles. Emotional energy is conserved. There's no room for excess feeling. Everything is measured, controlled. Leaders, meanwhile, feel justified. They are protecting their people. They are preparing for what others might do. And that belief hardens them, makes them less patient, less flexible, and more convinced of their own necessity. Conflict, when it happens now, is no longer surprising. It's expected, prepared for, and because it's expected, it feels strangely manageable. A terrible realization, really. Humans can get used to almost anything if it arrives slowly enough. As night settles, the settlement grows quiet. Not peaceful, just controlled. Fires burn lower, voices soften, watchers remain alert. And somewhere beyond the darkness, another settlement mirrors these same routines, convinced of the same logic. Next, we'll drift into the moment when organized fear gives rise to organized memory, when victories and losses start being recorded, repeated, and inherited. And when humans begin turning conflict into history rather than experience. We drift forward again, quietly, into a phase where something new begins settling into the human mind. Not fear itself, not conflict, but memory with intention. Until now, experiences faded naturally. A bad season passed, a dispute cooled, a loss was absorbed, and life continued. But now, people begin choosing what to remember, and that choice changes everything. Stories start lingering longer than the events that inspired them. Someone recalls a border dispute from years ago, but the details soften and sharpen in strange ways. The fear grows clearer, the cause grows simpler, the blame becomes more confident. Humans are very good at that. Memory stops being a record and starts being a tool. Let's float gently through an evening gathering. People sit close, firelight moving across familiar faces. Someone begins recounting a past conflict, not dramatically, calmly, almost casually. But the story has a shape now. There is a beginning, a wrong, a response. Children listen. They weren't there, but they don't need to be. The story fills the gap. And once filled, the gap never really closes. Victories feel larger in memory than they were in reality. Losses feel crueler. Complexity dissolves. Nuance is tiring, and tired people prefer clarity. So stories become cleaner. We were right, they were not. That's easier to carry into sleep. Leaders notice the power of this. Of course they do. Stories unify. Stories justify. Stories make decisions feel inevitable rather than chosen. A leader who controls memory doesn't need to argue as much. The past does the work for them. Let's pause on ritual, because repetition helps memory stick. Certain days are marked, certain actions repeated, not loudly, not elaborately, just enough to keep the past present. A shared silence, a shared gesture, a shared understanding that something once happened and still matters. Children grow up inside these memories. They inherit emotions before experiences. They feel anger toward people they've never met, caution toward places they've never seen, pride in actions they never took, and it feels natural. After all, it's all they've ever known. Silence changes again. It becomes respectful. Some topics are spoken softly, some names avoided, some questions left unasked. Memory draws boundaries round thought itself, and humans, who once explored freely, now navigate carefully through inherited feelings. Conflict becomes less personal and more symbolic. It's no longer about a field or a resource. It's about what happened before, and what might happen again, and what must never be forgotten. As night settles, the fire burns low. The story ends. People lie down carrying images that aren't theirs, but feel like they are. Memory drifts into dreams, and the past, now preserved, waits patiently to be reused. Next, we'll drift toward the moment when remembered conflict begins shaping identity itself. When humans stop asking what happened and start asking who are we because of it, we drift onward, still gently, into the phase where memory stops being something people carry and starts being something people are. This is a subtle transition. No one announces it. No one notices it happening. But one day, people stop describing themselves by what they do and start describing themselves by what they belong to. And once identity takes root, experience becomes optional. At first, identity is practical. It answers simple questions. Where are you from? Who are your people? Which stories do you share? These are useful shortcuts in a crowded, cautious world. But shortcuts have consequences. They flatten complexity. They replace curiosity with assumption. And slowly, people begin reacting not to individuals, but to categories. Let's float through a conversation between two strangers meeting near a border. They exchange names, then origins, then pauses appear. Tone shifts slightly, not hostile, just careful. Everything said afterward passes through identity first. Words are weighed, gestures measured. Experience no longer speaks for itself. It must pass inspection. Children absorb identity effortlessly. They learn it before they learn skepticism. They repeat phrases without context. They feel pride without achievement. They feel caution without cause. Identity is efficient that way. It saves thinking, and humans, especially tired ones, appreciate anything that saves effort. Leaders lean into this gently. They speak of shared traits, shared ancestors, shared destiny. Not aggressively, comfortingly. Identity feels warm when it's inclusive, protective when it's exclusive, and authority thrives in both spaces. Let's pause on clothing and symbols again, because by now they matter deeply. Patterns, colors, markings. None of them change survival directly, but they signal belonging instantly. And once belonging is visible, separation becomes effortless. No questions required. Silence around identity becomes loaded. Jokes stop. Curiosity retreats. Saying the wrong thing feels dangerous. Not because punishment is guaranteed, but because exclusion is. And exclusion, in settled societies, can be fatal in quieter ways. Conflict, when it occurs now, feels justified before it begins. Identity supplies reasons in advance. There is less hesitation, less doubt. People act not because they want to, but because it feels required. Obligation replaces impulse. Let's hover briefly over empathy, because it shrinks here. Not entirely, just selectively. Care concentrates inward. Outward concern fades. This isn't cruelty, it's conservation. Emotional resources feel limited, and humans prioritize their own. Of course they do. As night falls, people gather among those who look, speak, and think like them. Stories repeat, differences harden, and the world feels smaller, safer, and more predictable, which is comforting and dangerous. Next, we'll drift toward the moment when identity and authority merge completely. When leaders stop just representing groups and start embodying them. And when disagreement with power begins feeling like disagreement with who you are. We drift forward again, softly, into the phase where authority and identity merge so completely that leaders are no longer just individuals, they are the embodiment of the group itself. This is subtle at first. A gesture, a favored seat, a particular way of speaking. But over time, people stop seeing the leader as separate from the community. They are inseparable. Criticizing the leader feels like criticizing existence itself. At first, this is convenient. Decisions carry weight. Orders are followed. Disputes settle more quickly. People trust instinctively. But convenience has its costs. Authority becomes harder to question. Advice from outsiders is ignored. Dissent becomes uncomfortable before it becomes dangerous. And humans, being humans, adjust quietly. They conform without being forced. They observe without speaking. Let's float gently through a gathering where this is visible. The leader sits slightly elevated, not dramatically, just naturally. Others stand or sit nearby, watching. Words are measured. Movement is slow. Even laughter is tempered. Small glances communicate more than long speeches. And everyone, including the leader, is aware of the power contained in quiet observation. Children raised in this system learn to mimic the leader's behavior before they understand the rules that underpin it. They imitate gestures, intonations, even pauses. Identity and hierarchy intertwine in their minds, shaping thought patterns before reason has a chance to intervene. By adolescence, obedience and belonging are nearly indistinguishable. Rituals and ceremonies begin to codify the connection between the leader and the people. Not in grand temples yet, just in repeated patterns. Fires lit at certain times. Foods prepared in particular ways. Stories told in predictable sequences. Each repetition reinforces the idea. The leader is the people, and the people are the leader. Silence becomes reverent. Questions are carefully phrased. Opinions are soft-spoken. And even minor gestures leaning to casually, making an unintended noise can feel inappropriate. Humans are masters of reading subtle cues. And when subtle cues are tied to authority, behavior adjusts almost imperceptibly. Conflict now has a new dimension. Disputes are no longer about land or resources alone. They are about respect, about acknowledgement, about aligning with the living symbol of the group. Someone who acts incorrectly risks more than physical consequences. They risk social invisibility, exclusion, emotional dissonance. And that risk is more effective than any punishment. Let's pause briefly on personal life for these early leaders. They are human, after all. Sleep is irregular. Appetite is uneven. Emotions are contained but present. Fear, once practical, now lives quietly in the mind. Fear of misjudgment, fear of betrayal, fear of irrelevance. And unlike before, when mistakes could be silently absorbed, errors now ripple outward. They affect reputation, identity, even legacy. As night settles, the settlement feels cohesive yet fragile. Fires burn. Conversations are low. Children mimic adults unconsciously. Adults monitor one another gently. And the leader, the human symbol of this quiet world, watches over it all, aware that presence alone is power. Presence, in this phase of humanity, has become as influential as action. Next, we'll drift into the moment when these patterns start repeating across multiple settlements, when symbols of power become portable, and when early human societies begin forming networks of influence, competition, and subtle alliances that stretch beyond a single camp. We drift forward, slowly and softly, into a phase where human groups stop existing in isolation. For a long time, each settlement lived almost entirely within itself, its boundaries defined by observation and habit rather than maps or walls. But humans are curious, and curiosity never truly rests. Small groups begin noticing neighboring camps, sometimes from a hill, sometimes from smoke on the horizon, and eventually they realize there are others like us, not far away. At first, contact is cautious and minimal. Messages are gestures, exchanges are brief. A gift, a shared word, a warning. Humans are good at reading subtle cues, so miscommunication is slow, measured, and exhausting rather than explosive. The other group is a curiosity and simultaneously a potential threat. It's thrilling and tiring in equal measure. Leaders quickly recognize opportunity, not just opportunity to expand resources, though that matters, but opportunity to secure alliances and reinforce status. A leader who can navigate relations beyond their own camp now carries prestige that no single settlement can grant. Influence begins to stretch outward. Presence becomes diplomacy, and humans, ever observant, adjust behavior to align with the extended network of power. Trade emerges naturally. One settlement offers pottery, another offers dried fish. Bartering, simple at first, develops rules. Fairness is debated subtly. Trust is tested, and with trust comes obligation. Humans are very good at remembering obligations, even when those obligations are inconvenient or long delayed. Memory begins to operate not just within families or camps, but between them. Conflict also emerges, slowly and predictably. Small disputes over shared land, hunting grounds, or water appear, not violent at first, not dramatic, just tension, measured, simmering, carried in looks and gestures. Humans are masters of low-level conflict. They escalate carefully, calculatingly, because unlike the forest, confrontation now has social and long-term consequences. Let's pause on communication. With multiple settlements, language, though still limited, expands in subtle ways. Certain words carry meaning beyond survival. Codes, signals, rituals begin to standardize. Smoke becomes a system. Sound becomes a message. Observation becomes information. Humans adapt fluidly, almost imperceptibly, because survival now depends on understanding not only your own camp, but everyone nearby. Children grow up in a world that is quietly wider than it once was. They learn not only their own settlements' ways, but also the habits, signals, and expectations of the nearby group. They absorb comparisons naturally. Who works harder? Who is taller? Who is quieter? Who is cleverer? Competition is subtle, almost unconscious, yet profoundly influential. Religion adjusts again. Gods now favor groups as well as individuals. Protection rituals extend to neighboring camps. Shared myths begin bridging the distance between settlements. Ritual becomes a tool for cohesion, and humans, naturally inclined toward ritual, embrace it without question. Silence shifts in this phase. 2. It carries information. A pause during conversation communicates more than words. Listening becomes a skill. Observation becomes a social requirement. And humans grow adept at reading unspoken signals across ever-widening networks. As night falls over multiple settlements, fires burn in parallel. Shadows flicker on familiar walls and unfamiliar tents. Humans sleep lightly, attuned to distant movement and distant sound. Presence matters even when it is unseen, and the stage is quietly set for the next phase, where memory, identity, and authority no longer exist only within a single settlement, but begin interacting across landscapes, creating networks of influence that will shape human history for millennia. Next, we'll drift into how early human societies slowly started forming alliances, rivalries, and proto-diplomatic systems, all while maintaining the quiet, measured pace that had defined them for tens of thousands of years. We drift forward, unhurried, into the quiet era when settlements begin to notice patterns not just in themselves, but in each other. Observing another group is no longer a curiosity, it becomes a strategy. Humans are subtle learners, so they watch, they measure, and they remember. Alliances form, not with ceremony, but with gestures, repeated favors, and the occasional carefully shared resource. And because humans are cautious by nature, these alliances are always delicate. At first, they are almost invisible. A day spent helping another settlement carry water. A fire lit nearby as a sign of welcome. A child traded temporarily to learn new skills. Small acts, quiet signals, but profoundly meaningful. Trust builds slowly, measured by repeated reliability rather than words. And once trust is established, it becomes another layer of social memory, another set of expectations that everyone must remember. Leaders become brokers of these alliances. It is no longer enough to manage one settlement. Influence must now extend outward. Negotiation becomes an art of subtlety. Words are chosen carefully. Pauses carry weight. Even silence is meaningful. A pause in response can reassure or intimidate. A small gesture can cement loyalty or hint at displeasure. And humans, always attuned to subtle cues, adjust accordingly. But alongside alliances, rivalries quietly smolder. A shared resource becomes contested. A perceived slight is remembered. A story of past cooperation is retold with slight exaggeration. These rivalries are not dramatic, no swords drawn, no fires set, just tension simmering in the background, expressed in sidelong glances, measured gestures, and sometimes in subtle exclusion. Humans are masters of long, quiet grudges. Trade continues, but it now carries political weight. Who receives what, and how often, signals status and favor. Memory becomes currency. Favors remembered and favors owed form the invisible backbone of relationships. And humans, ever mindful of imbalance, adjust behavior accordingly, carefully monitoring the social ledger that exists entirely in their minds. Religion adapts again, quietly reinforcing alliances and rivalries. Myths now include cautionary tales about neighboring groups. Rituals bless cooperation and warn against betrayal. Gods, once abstract, are now subtly political, favoring some settlements over others. And humans internalize these preferences without thinking twice. Children grow up in these networks of quiet expectation. They learn not only to work within their settlement, but to anticipate and interpret behaviors in neighboring camps. Observation becomes education. Memory becomes training. Subtlety becomes instinct. They internalize patterns of alliance, trust, and rivalry long before they can articulate them. Silence in this phase carries even more weight. Conversations are measured, pauses deliberate, and laughter moderated. Every gesture might be interpreted as loyalty or doubt. Listening becomes as valuable as speaking, and those who misread signals learn quickly that subtle errors can ripple outward in unexpected ways. As night falls, multiple settlements settle into sleep, fires glowing faintly against the dark. Alliances are unspoken but understood. Rivalries simmer quietly, noted in glances and small stories shared near the fire. Humans sleep lightly, aware that tomorrow they will continue navigating the complex, invisible threads that now connect them across the landscape. Next, we'll drift into the moment when memory, identity, and alliances start formalizing into early customs, proto-laws, and the first murmurs of structured society, still slow, quiet, and deliberate, but increasingly intricate. We drift forward, still gently, into a phase where human networks of memory, identity, and observation start to solidify into something more structured. Until now, rules were unwritten, carried in gestures, stories, and expectations. But humans, being what they are, start noticing patterns that repeat. Patterns that cause friction, patterns that keep the group safe, and they begin codifying them. Quietly, subtly, without fanfare. These are the first customs. Customs at first are simple. Who eats first? Who carries water? Who tends the fire? When disputes occur, stories of past solutions become templates. A solution that worked once is repeated. Memory, once flexible, starts behaving like a quiet law. And humans, who excel at repetition and observation, internalize these templates naturally. Compliance is rarely enforced. It is anticipated. Deviance is noted. Deviance is remembered. Let's float gently through a settlement in this phase. A child spills water onto another's food. There is no outcry, just a measured sigh, a gentle correction, and the expectation that the child will learn. The lesson is reinforced by memory, by repetition, and subtly by observation of how others behave. The child absorbs the pattern. The pattern becomes a rule without ever being written. Humans are very good at that. Authority operates through modeling behavior rather than formal instruction. Actions speak louder than commands. Leaders guide these early customs, but they rarely dictate. If a leader tends the fire first or carries the water for elders, the group learns, quietly, that these behaviors are valued. Status is subtly reinforced. Prestige grows. Compliance becomes instinctive. Trade and alliances continue to shape customs. Rituals emerge to smooth interactions between settlements. Exchange protocols, rules for hospitality, even rules for conflict avoidance start crystallizing. The patterns are slow, deliberate, almost invisible, but they endure because repetition solidifies memory. Humans internalize these protocols in daily life. They are taught not in words, but in practice. Religion continues to reinforce custom. Ceremonies mark seasonal work, harvests, and social obligations. Myths remind people of past mistakes, subtly encoding dos and don'ts into stories. The gods now oversee not only survival, but behavior. Disobedience is framed as not just inconvenient, but morally and spiritually consequential. Humans, naturally attuned to ritual, adopt these expectations almost unconsciously. Children, of course, absorb all of this. They mimic adult behaviors, remember patterns, repeat rituals, and learn through observation and repetition rather than formal teaching. Experience becomes subordinate to inherited wisdom. Memory becomes law. Observation becomes curriculum. Identity becomes inseparable from participation in customs. Silence evolves yet again. It becomes reflective, laden with expectation. Pauses in conversation signal agreement, understanding, or disapproval. Observing others quietly becomes essential to understanding the social rules. Humans learn quickly that speaking too much or too little can carry consequences that are social, emotional, and sometimes even practical. As night falls over these interconnected settlements, fires burn steadily. Stories, rituals, and memory intertwine. Customs, subtle yet firm, guide behavior without written law. Humans sleep lightly, carrying the weight of expectation, the lessons of memory, and the quiet understanding of their social world. Next, we'll drift toward the moment when settlements begin formalizing leadership roles further. When inheritance of authority and codification of customs blend into proto-government, slowly and deliberately, still without fanfare, still measured, still intimate, we drift onward, slowly and quietly, into the phase where authority ceases to be just a matter of presence or personality, and begins to take on a more formal, structured shape. Leadership is no longer entirely earned in the moment through clever decisions or displays of strength. Now, it begins to be expected, observed, and passed down. Authority becomes almost hereditary, though not in the rigid way we later call monarchy. It is subtle, gradual, and socially reinforced. At first, this structure is practical. The child of a respected leader grows up watching the rhythms of decision-making. They carry water, observe disputes, and absorb the patterns of negotiation. By adulthood, the group has internalized that this individual is next in line, not because of decree, but because social memory has been trained to accept it. Humans, being excellent pattern recognizers, adapt without fuss. Let's float gently through a settlement where this is happening. The current leader sits at the center of activity, but nearby, a young person the air mirrors movements, observes interactions, and speaks only when spoken to. Others watch the air as carefully as they watch the leader. A glance, a gesture, or a slight smile can communicate approval or subtle disapproval. Social norms enforce authority more efficiently than punishment ever could. Trade, alliances, and disputes across settlements now reinforce these structures. A recognized heir carries authority even in interactions beyond their home settlement. The presence of an accepted figure reduces negotiation friction. Protocols form around deference. Who speaks first? Who listens? How gestures are made? Authority, once fluid, solidifies into expectation. Religion plays a quiet but critical role. Ceremonies and rituals mark succession, subtly reinforcing legitimacy. Ancestors' deeds, and the favor of gods combine to create a moral and social justification for inherited leadership. Children and adults alike internalize that leadership is not just practical, but sacred. Subtle reverence enforces compliance without coercion. Children in these structured settlements learn to navigate hierarchy early. They know who decides, who mediates, and who interprets memory. Even minor social interactions are filtered through these hierarchies. Children experiment carefully, imitate subtly, and absorb patterns before they can question them. Authority becomes both visible and invisible, a force felt more than openly discussed. Silence changes once again. It becomes both respectful and strategic. Speaking out of turn is noticed immediately, even if unnoticed formally. Listening becomes a skill, a way to gauge intention, allegiance, and social position. The quiet carries as much meaning as words, if not more. As night falls, fires burn low. The heir sits near the elder leader, observing, learning. Other settlement members sit in small clusters, quietly practicing the patterns that reinforce order, memory, and identity. Tension is minimal, but constant. Comfort and unease coexist. The world feels small, predictable, and structured, yet still fragile enough to demand attention. Next, we'll drift into the phase when settlements, armed with structured leadership and inherited authority, begin forming proto-cities, clusters of humans with defined social hierarchies, early customs, and networks of influence reaching beyond their immediate surroundings. This is where permanence, memory, and identity converge into the earliest seeds of civilization. We drift forward again, slowly, almost imperceptibly, into the phase where individual settlements begin linking into clusters, not out of necessity alone, but because stability encourages permanence. Fields are reliable, storage is secure, leadership is recognized, inherited, and respected. And in such conditions, humans notice a simple truth. It's easier to live together than apart, even with the subtle complications of proximity. At first, clustering is practical. Families and leaders settle near each other for safety, for shared labor, and for convenience in trade. Paths become worn, signaling regular movement. Fires burn in predictable patterns. Food storage and water access begin to influence where homes are built. These are not cities yet far from it, but the pattern of permanence is unmistakable. Humans are quietly learning urbanism without architecture, social complexity without formal laws. Let's float through a cluster of settlements. Smoke rises from multiple hearths. People carry water from a shared source. Children run, carefully navigating paths where adults walk with purpose. Leaders move among their clusters, observing, subtly directing. Their authority is visible and reinforced through presence, gestures, and repeated behavior, rather than formal decree. Memory, identity, and hierarchy are encoded in every glance and every step. Trade becomes more predictable. Resources that were once rare locally are now shared across the cluster. Exchange protocols develop, extending beyond a single settlement. Reputation grows in importance. A reliable trader gains subtle influence. Memory of favors and slight misdeeds becomes social currency. Alliances, disputes, and negotiations are no longer isolated, they ripple across multiple communities. Religion adapts again, quietly and consistently. Ceremonies now mark not just seasonal cycles, but the relationships between neighboring clusters. Offerings, stories, and rituals reinforce group cohesion. Ancestors and deities oversee not just survival, but social order itself. Compliance feels natural. Ritual reinforces authority, hierarchy, and identity simultaneously, subtly embedding the concept of shared social memory across multiple settlements. Children growing up in these clusters are exposed to patterns of behavior far wider than their immediate family. They learn to navigate multiple hierarchies, recognize authority figures beyond their home, and internalize rules and customs that extend across space and generations. Observation becomes training. Memory becomes governance. Identity becomes social strategy. Silence takes on new meaning. It becomes layered, respectful in the presence of leaders, cautious around unfamiliar neighbors, attentive in observing rituals. Pauses in conversation signal acknowledgement, agreement, or subtle disagreement. Listening becomes more than a skill, it becomes an essential survival strategy within the cluster. As night settles over the interconnected settlements, fires burn steadily in predictable patterns. People sleep lightly, attuned to neighboring activity, remembering obligations, and observing status subtly in dreams. The first seeds of urban social networks are taking root, quietly teaching humans how to live together in ways that will eventually define civilization itself. Next, we'll drift into the gradual emergence of more formal leadership hierarchies across these clusters, proto-councils, and councils of influence when authority begins to extend beyond single settlements and memory. Ritual and identity organize life on a broader scale. We drift forward slowly into the phase where leadership no longer belongs to one settlement alone. The clusters of humans we've been observing are beginning to notice the limits of isolated authority. One leader can guide one settlement, manage disputes, and maintain memory and ritual, but when settlements cluster, influence must stretch further. Authority becomes a network, quietly extending across space. At first, this extension is informal. A respected elder negotiates with another settlement's leader about trade, shared water, or grazing grounds. They meet at neutral spots. They observe one another carefully. Decisions are mutual, though subtly weighted by reputation, age, or accumulated favors. Influence grows not by force, but by trust, memory, and social skill. And humans, always sensitive to hierarchy, adjust naturally. Let's float gently through a cluster where this is occurring. Leaders from neighboring settlements gather near a central hearth. Conversation is calm, slow, deliberate. Pauses carry weight. Smiles and gestures are measured. Even silence communicates understanding or subtle warning. The decisions made here will ripple quietly through multiple communities. Authority is no longer local, it is relational. Trade and exchange protocols expand. Certain families gain reputations as reliable intermediaries. Memory now spans settlements. Favors remembered, slights remembered, obligations carried across distances. Humans internalize these patterns without formal record keeping. Memory itself becomes governance. Religion continues to reinforce these early networks. Shared rituals now connect settlements. Offerings are coordinated. Myths are told to reinforce cooperation and caution simultaneously. Gods, ancestors, and spiritual authority quietly validate decisions made between leaders. Compliance feels natural because it is embedded in both social and spiritual expectation. Children in these clusters grow up navigating multiple hierarchies. They observe behaviors, imitate them, and internalize rules that extend beyond their home. Loyalty and obligation are understood across settlements, not just within. Memory becomes more than personal, it becomes collective, woven into the network of relationships that structure daily life. Silence evolves again. In group gatherings, the pause before speaking conveys respect, caution, or acknowledgement. Listening becomes crucial. Gestures, subtle shifts in stance, and minor facial expressions are interpreted with care. Humans, as ever, are excellent at reading these unspoken cues, and the network thrives on subtlety rather than overt command. As night settles across multiple clustered settlements, fires glow in alignment. Stories echo across distances, and leaders rest lightly, aware that influence now depends not just on personal authority, but on observation, memory, and relational skill. The earliest forms of inter-settlement governance are taking shape quiet, deliberate, and cumulative, like sediment building slowly over time. Next, we'll drift into the emergence of proto-councils and assemblies, where multiple leaders begin coordinating formally. Rituals and memory intertwine with political practice, and early human society starts showing the first recognizable forms of structured governance. We drift forward, softly, into the phase where human settlements begin organizing beyond individual leadership and informal alliances. Authority starts to take on a slightly more structured, deliberate form. Proto-councils. These gatherings are quiet affairs, not grand assemblies, but small, intentional meetings where leaders from several settlements come together to coordinate decisions, settle disputes, and manage shared resources. At first, these councils are simple. 2 or 3 leaders meet near a central fire, exchange news of harvests, discuss grazing lands, or decide which paths should remain open. Decisions are slow, measured, deliberate. Consensus matters. Authority is persuasive rather than coercive. Humans are cautious learners, and they prefer agreement that feels earned rather than forced. Let's float gently through one of these councils. Leaders sit in a circle. Hands rest on knees or support chins. Voices are calm, slightly monotone, measured. Pauses are intentional. A glance can signal agreement, disagreement, or subtle warning. No one raises their voice. Arguments, if they arise, are quiet and reflective. Humans, trained by observation and memory, respond to these cues instinctively. Trade and exchange across settlements gain new significance. Rules become formalized without being written. Certain individuals are acknowledged as mediators. Favors are carefully remembered. Slights are recorded in memory. Obligations stretch across settlements and generations. Humans navigate this system with care, relying on observation, patience, and subtle social memory rather than explicit enforcement. Religion quietly reinforces the council structure. Rituals coordinate with council meetings. Offerings are shared to honor ancestors or deities who protect multiple communities. Stories remind participants of past successes and failures, reinforcing social norms. Gods and ancestors now play an invisible role in governance, giving weight to decisions and making compliance feel natural. Children grow up watching these councils, learning to read subtle cues, imitate leaders, and internalize social norms across multiple settlements. Observation becomes training. Memory becomes law. Identity extends beyond the home settlement. Humans, from a young age, understand both their obligations and the expectations of others. Silence in these councils carries profound meaning. Pauses are weighed carefully. Listening is as valuable as speaking. Even minor gestures, leaning forward, shifting a hand, a quiet exhale, are interpreted and influence decision-making. Humans, ever sensitive to nuance, thrive in this subtle network of communication. As night settles over interconnected settlements, the fires glow quietly in alignment. Elders and leaders rest lightly, and agreements reached in hushed meetings ripple through the landscape. Influence now spans multiple communities, mediated by observation, memory, and ritual, forming the earliest recognizable networks of governance, still subtle, still intimate, and still measured, but increasingly complex. Next, we'll drift into how these proto-councils evolved into more formalized leadership structures, with repeated rituals, codified customs, and increasingly inherited authority, laying the groundwork for the very first permanent societies. We drift forward slowly into the phase where proto-councils no longer meet only to coordinate small tasks or resolve minor disputes. Influence begins to formalize. Roles become recognized across settlements. Certain individuals are consistently looked to for guidance. Authority becomes stable, predictable, and increasingly tied to inheritance. These councils are still subtle, quiet, and deliberate, but the patterns they enforce ripple across generations. At first, the change is barely noticeable. A council member sits slightly differently, speaks with slightly more confidence, or is observed more frequently. Memory enforces recognition. Past actions of reliability, wisdom, or subtle decisiveness now give someone precedence. Humans, trained by observation and repetition, accept these hierarchies naturally. Leadership becomes partially formalized without needing decree. Let's float through a meeting where this is visible. Leaders gather near the central fire of a cluster. Voices are soft, monotone, steady. Pauses are calculated. Every gesture communicates meaning. Who speaks first? Who listens? Who acknowledges? Decision-making is slow, reflective, and deliberate. The council relies on shared memory of past agreements. Authority now spans multiple settlements, subtly enforced by custom, ritual, and observation. Trade, alliance, and obligation reinforce council decisions. A favor remembered in one settlement carries weight in another. Slights are recalled across space and time, affecting negotiations quietly but decisively. Humans internalize these networks, learning obligations and authority through subtle observation rather than explicit enforcement. Memory is law. Observation is governance. Identity is participation. Religion continues to intertwine with governance. Rituals now mark transitions of authority, coordination of shared resources, and resolutions of inter-settlement disputes. Ancestors and deities are invoked not only to protect settlements, but also to bless decisions and agreements. Compliance feels sacred, almost instinctive. Humans rarely question the spiritual justification of authority because it aligns seamlessly with social and practical necessity. Children growing up in these clusters navigate increasingly complex hierarchies. They observe councils, imitate gestures, and learn to anticipate subtle signals of authority. Memory and observation are internalized as natural skills. Identity now encompasses not only the home settlement, but the broader network. Social intelligence is cultivated from a young age, shaping behavior long before conscious reasoning develops. Silence continues to evolve. It carries weight, meaning, and subtle instruction. Pauses communicate respect, agreement, or caution. Listening is as skilled as critical as speech. Humans learn that their survival and social standing depend on their ability to interpret and act upon subtle cues. Subtlety itself becomes a form of governance. As night settles, fires glow across multiple settlements, and people sleep lightly, aware of the invisible threads connecting them. Councils, customs, memory, ritual, and inherited authority are now intertwined. These systems quietly prepare humans for larger and more permanent social structures. We drift forward slowly into the moment when clusters of human communities stop drifting entirely and begin to settle in fixed locations. The landscape, once dominated by temporary shelters and wandering groups, now hosts long-term habitations. People have learned the rhythms of seasons, the locations of water, and the cycles of food availability. Leadership, memory, and ritual have stabilized, and under these quiet conditions, permanence becomes possible. At first, the settlements are simple. Huts or small dwellings ranged near shared water sources. Paths worn over years. Communal areas for gathering, storage, and fire. Fires burn predictably. Children run along familiar paths. Adults observe, maintain, and guide. These are not yet cities. They are small, permanent concentrations of human life. But permanence, once established, changes everything socially, culturally, and psychologically. Let's float gently through one of these early settlements. The central fire burns low. Leaders sit near it, quietly observing and listening. Decisions are made slowly, almost imperceptibly. Memory governs interactions. Past favors, past slights, past successes all inform behavior. Observation enforces social norms. Even small gestures carry meaning. Authority is recognized without argument. Trade and exchange become more formalized. Certain families handle specific goods. Reputation matters. Memory spans. Generations. Favors owed. Alliances maintained. And agreements upheld. Humans navigate these systems intuitively, learning obligation, loyalty, and negotiation through subtle observation and participation rather than formal instruction. Religion and ritual continue to structure daily life. Ceremonies mark the seasons, successful hunts, and births, but also transitions of authority and resolution of disputes. Ancestors are honored, deities are invoked. Compliance feels both social and spiritual. Participation reinforces identity, belonging, and the moral weight of custom. Children growing up in these settlements inherit complex social structures. They learn to navigate hierarchy, observe authority, and internalize obligations across family, settlement, and neighboring settlements. Memory becomes law. Observation becomes curriculum. Identity encompasses both home and community. Even before they can articulate rules, they live them. Silence deepens its meaning. Pauses carry respect. Gestures signal agreement or caution. Listening becomes critical. Humans, subtle and observant, thrive in this environment of layered communication. Every action is measured. Every interaction reinforces social patterns. As night falls, the settlement glows softly with fires. Humans sleep lightly, aware of neighbors, leadership, obligations, and rituals that extend through generations. The first permanent societies have quietly emerged. Memory, identity, authority, and ritual are intertwined. Life is structured, predictable, and resilient, yet subtle enough that the social fabric feels almost invisible. Next, we'll drift into how these permanent settlements gradually expanded, interacted with one another, and evolved into early proto-cities, setting the stage for civilization itself.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them. Cold weather hot there. Dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones. they Robert Wood. This was a huge discover. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans to spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factories started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.